All right, here we go. So we're doing lesson 8. This is the life of Isaac and Jacob. I almost tried to squeeze in lesson 9 and get to the Exodus so that when we had the break because of the vacation I'm going on, that we would be able to, be that the 400 years stuck in Egypt, kind of thing. But, I am going to Arizona, so it's pretty close. But yeah, it was too much to do that because we'll be covering the Exodus and everything when we get back. But it is kind of neat that we'll kind of end the patriarchal period here. And then when I get back after Thanksgiving, we'll pick up with the conquest and such like that. I would be interested to hear from you guys if you guys can be thinking, and I'll talk with you next time we meet, which is not going. So next week, no class. There's going to be basically 3 weeks of no class because we're leaving probably next Wednesday night, heading out to Phoenix, and then we'll be coming back the Saturday right before the Sunday following. There's Thanksgiving, and then Sunday, and then right before the following Sunday. So there's those 3 weeks that we're gone. But I'd be interested to hear from you what Wednesday nights in December you want off for Christmas. And so when we get back, we can have like 1 or 2 or how many Wednesday nights. So if you guys can just be ready to answer that question when we regather back after Thanksgiving, that would be great. Okay. So with Isaac, we see as the narrative moves away from Abraham after his death and on to Isaac, we begin to have a picture of Isaac's faith and his relationship with God. So when Isaac is 60, which is 20 years into his marriage with Rebekah, he's still childless. So we know from this that he was 40 when he and Rebekah were married. And then they go through those first 20 years of marriage, no child, and Rebekah is crying out, wanting children. And so Isaac prays for his wife. And this is kind of the first thing you see him interacting with God by praying and asking for his wife to be able to have a child. And then God opens the womb and grants her the twins. This is something that throughout the Old Testament, the opening and closing of the womb is something that is very clearly seen as being in the hands of God. And we're going to see when we get to the law that one of the things when the nation starts to go away from God is he's going to corporately begin to close off the womb and prevent the women from bearing all of the children, because that's part of his blessing. And you'll also see that the blessing on certain ones of the tribes, like the blessing on the tribe of Ephraim, results in them having tons of children and being this huge tribe that's bigger than a lot of the other tribes, even though it's one of the younger of the tribes. And so it's interesting in some of that way. Abrahamic covenant promises affirmed with Isaac in Genesis 26, 1 through 5. And so we clearly see he's the one who the promise is going to go through. So when Rebekah does finally have kids, she has twins. So remember, this is a time when you didn't have ultrasounds. So she's pregnant and she just feels all this funky stuff going on. And how much they knew at that time how to tell whether they're twins, they were probably a lot smarter than we give them credit for. But we don't know. But she, because of all of what is happening, she goes and she inquires of the Lord about what's going on. Why do I have this happening in my womb? And that's when she finds out that there are twins inside of her, 2 nations that are inside of her. When God answers her, he says that the older is going to serve the younger, and that the younger will be greater. And so Jacob then is predicted ahead of time as being the one that's going to be greater, and Esau, who is the firstborn, is the one who is going to be lesser. When Esau comes out, it speaks of him being red. There's also when he gives up his birthright for the soup, it was for a red stew is what it is. And interestingly, in the Chinese Bible, it's red bean soup. And if you've ever had red bean soup, it's actually pretty good. It's a nice sweet dessert. But it's this red thing. And which one exactly it is. It does end up being a lentil thing. It's mentioned later as being lentils, but there's something red about it. But in either, whether it's at birth or this red bean soup, his nickname becomes Red. And so that's Esau's nickname. Well, Red in Hebrew is Edom. And so Edom as a nation is, you're going to hear all throughout the Old Testament, you're going to hear Edom and Edom over and over and over again. It's because of that nickname of Red for Esau, but they are always the descendants of Esau that it's speaking of. So this tension between the two of them, especially after the things that Jacob's going to pull, is part of why you see through the whole history of the Old Testament that Edom and Israel are contentious, but they're actually brother nations. The Moabites and the Ammonites, as we said before, they're from Lot's descendants, so they're cousin nations. Edom's the closest nation to Israel in actual relation. One I have here, how did she inquire of the Lord? When it comes down to Rebecca going and inquiring of the Lord, I don't know the answer to that question. It's just this interesting thing that there was a way for her to inquire of the Lord at that time, and it doesn't seem to have been through Isaac. And so there's that question of, what is that? Is that still like a Melchizedek? Is this, what is that's there? If you guys know the answer, you can tell me. But otherwise, it's just something fun to think about. So when you look at Isaac's life, he seems to be a very passive and unaggressive man. There's a lot of times he comes into conflict over wells and he just go ahead, take it. Go ahead, take it. And just moves back. So there's not... he seems to be a fairly content person who's sitting there raising his two sons, and we're really not told a lot about what his life is like. And you stop and you think about that, because his life was pretty long, and yet we're told very little about who he is. And he's kind of that guy sandwiched in between. You got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We know a lot about Abraham. We know a lot about Jacob. We know almost nothing about Isaac. And so it is kind of interesting to see that. We don't have any record of him traveling outside of the Promised Land. There's one time where he may have gone down into Egypt for a famine, and God says, nope, stay here. And so we don't have any time when he goes outside of the land. He didn't even go outside of the land to find his wife like Jacob did, because he had the servant of his father went and did that. So really quite a kind of a homebody in that sense. The marriage that he had, it was arranged, but they seem to be pretty happy, because he's actually found flirting with his wife by Abimelech, and it's significant enough that Abimelech sees it and goes, that's his wife, and knows that. Now, one thing about the Abimelech and this happening is Abimelech had this with Abraham too, and so you're like, is this the same Abimelech or not? But what I'd remind you is that there are still people at this time. If you look at that timeline that I gave you, there's still people at this time living to 400 years old. And we're going to read from Jacob. If you look at one of the quotes on that, Jacob, when he goes down into Egypt and meets up with the Pharaoh, the Pharaoh's like, how old are you? And he says, few and bad have my days been, and they have not attained to the days of my father. So there are other people that are much older. And so basically what you have happening with Abraham and Isaac is still could be the same Abimelech, but the second time he's much older. And so with the Abimelech the second time, you'll notice that the first time Abimelech takes Sarah to be like his wife, and then God shows up and warns him and so on and so forth. The second time, no one takes him as his wife. Isaac has just said, this is my sister, and he hasn't said it. And Abimelech just notices, and he says, what are you doing? Someone in the kingdom could have taken her. So it's not him wanting to take Rebecca as his wife. So it could be a much older Abimelech at that time as well because of that. So when you have Isaac starting out, he's in Hebron, but when there is a famine, God says, don't go down into Egypt. but instead stay in this land. And so he settles near Philistia. So just keep these in mind as I go to this map. He moves from Hebron. This is the Dead Sea. We're looking at the plain, the coastal plain of southern Israel. But he moves from Hebron down into the plain, and he comes more in contact with Philistia, and this is where he comes in contact with Abimelech. And while he's here, he plants crops, and during a famine receives 100-fold back. That's a pretty good crop. And so when he gets that back, people begin to realize that he's blessed, and so he's here and he digs a well, but the Philistines come and like, that's our well. He's like, okay, so he backs off and he digs another well over here, and they come and like, that's our well, and so he backs off further until they just stop bugging him about the wells, and then they come, they're like, you need to get out of here because you're getting too powerful for us. You're getting too strong. And so he's like, okay, so he goes a little bit further, and then he founds Beersheba. And after he's in Beersheba, the Philistines, they begin, it seems to be that they notice that, okay, when he was here, God was really blessing. And so we see that we're going to go make a treaty with Isaac because we want to still, have that blessing as well. Or they could just be afraid that with a God that powerful on his side, they didn't want him to interfere. And what these statements show is that Isaac basically has become so wealthy. And I'll put it this way, if Abraham could have fielded 318 men, I think Isaac could have fielded even more. There actually is a place where Jacob says that, God blessed Abraham, but then he's blessed each one of them more than the one before. And so Isaac probably became even larger in his entourage moving around than Abraham was. So you then get into the story of Jacob and Esau, and the focus gets off of Isaac pretty quick and gets on to Jacob and his relationship with Esau. Now, Jacob and Esau, they were born at the same time. Esau came out first. Jacob was grasping his heel. That's where Jacob gets his name. Jacob means kind of heel grasper or cheater. And so they kind of grow up. They're twins, but they are a little bit different. How are they different? One's hairier than the other one. How else? How else?
Likes to stay home, the other likes to hunt.
Yeah, one stays home and does stuff in the home. The other one goes out and is hunting. And so there's a little bit of a sense, like Esau is this like man's man, but really Jacob, as we would see, is not somebody he's not effeminate. He's not in any way of that sort, and it's just he's different. He doesn't go out hunting. He takes care of the flocks instead of going out hunting, and he's just not as hairy. And the fact that you could put on an animal skin to be equal to Esau's hairiness shows you Esau's pretty hairy. And so maybe he's the missing link. I don't know. But yeah, so Esau is out hunting one day, and he comes back, and he's famished, and he wants to have food, and Jacob's sitting there making food, and he's like, sure, I'll give you this food if you give me your birthright. Now, it can be really easy for us to go to Esau and go, you're an idiot. Why did you give up your birthright for that? But if you look at what it's saying, and you stop and remember where they're at, they're not where you've got Ralph's or a grocery store down the road, or someplace you can go and grab food. There's no restaurants you can pop in and do that. He's been out hunting, and if he didn't catch anything and there wasn't anything and he couldn't find anything to eat, he may have not eaten for days, And so he comes back and he's like, I'm starving. And Jacob's like, really? Well, before I give this to you, you begin to see he's quite a conniver, because he's like, I'm gonna get you while you're weak, and I'm going to trick you into giving up your birthright. And so he does trick him into giving up his birthright. And the reason why I say that Esau was probably more hungry than what we typically think is he says, "What good is a birthright to me if I'm dead?" So we can say he's just super exaggerating, but I think he's very close to that, and Jacob just took advantage of the situation. Now, another part of this as we go through this is to realize just how God did not choose Jacob because he was a great guy. That is clear in the whole story when you see what Jacob did. So then, when you have the blessings, you have the stolen birthright, and then it gets to the place where Isaac is going to bless his sons. It's interesting to me that Isaac says, my eyes are weak, and I don't know when the day of my death will be. So, son, go out and kill some game and come back and make a meal for me so I can bless you. And then Isaac lives for like another 20 years. So it's like, come on, Isaac, you're a little bit, down on this a little too much. You're depressed or something. But he sends Esau out to do that. And then Rebekah is the one who says to Jacob, "Now, what you need to do is you need to trick your dad into giving you the blessing instead of Esau the blessing." Now, at this point, you begin to stop and think, like, how right or wrong of Rebekah is this to do? She's the one that received the message from the Lord saying the older will serve the younger. Now, do you think she told her husband? Probably. Do you think her husband listened? Probably not. I mean, I see all the women kind of going, "Yes, we know that feeling." But we don't know for sure if she told him. She might not have told him, but she probably did tell him. But she knows that from God, it's supposed to be the other way around. Whereas clearly Isaac favors Esau and wants to instead give the blessing to Esau. Rachel, in what she's doing, when Jacob objects and says, "If I do that, I'm not only not going to probably get a blessing, because if Dad picks up on this, he's going to curse me." And then she's like, "Well, let the curse fall on me." So in one sense, this is a step of faith by Rebekah going, "No, I know what God has planned. I know what he wants because of what he said." But remember, she's heard this like 30 some years probably before this. And this is when she's coming back and standing on faith of that. So here you have Isaac getting ready to bless Jacob, and this act of blessing Jacob and Esau, we see two things. One, the binding nature of Isaac's blessing. First part is that we talked before about the Mari and Nuzi texts, which were these things we found archaeologically, and you wonder in the story, why can't Isaac just switch? Why can't he go, "Well, you tricked me, so no, this blessing goes here," and this, because there's this binding nature of those blessings. The interesting thing about that binding nature of those blessings is God honored the binding nature of that blessing, and what Isaac said about Jacob came true, and God fulfilled that. And so even in that, you see God's sovereign work interacting with man's free will. And this is the strangest part, because you've got a conniving son, a conniving mom, if you want to put it that way, and they're working together to trick this, and yet it ends up being everything that was in line with God's plan. And it's important for us to begin then to see man does all that we do, but God just brings out what he's going to bring out. And it's never attributed to what the man has done, because God already planned for them to do it. But man does all this stuff, but God's just going to do what he planned on doing. And that's a big part of how he brings out his sovereign will. So Rebekah doing what she did and encouraging Jacob to pretend to be Esau. She's acting in accordance with the prophecy And she's the one, in a sense, that's actually honoring and having faith in God more so than Isaac at that moment. And she does that, and God blesses what she did because it was in line with that. And then when you look at the lives of Jacob and Esau during this time period, you see Esau showing the path of the unchosen fulfilling their unchosenness, and the life of Jacob as an example of the chosen fulfilling their chosenness. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, when we sit down and we think about God choosing people or not choosing people, very clearly, with this thing that was given to Rebekah, God chose Jacob and did not choose Esau. This is picked up by Paul in Romans, and he quotes, look at how God chose here between the twins, because it says Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, which is actually a quote from Malachi 1, where God says that in that place. But in Malachi 1, what God is saying is, yeah, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, but that was based on God and his plan, not on how good you guys were, Israelites. That's what Malachi is saying in that context. So Esau, what do we see in his life? He's born, he's the firstborn, but because of this vision, he's just not going to do it. He's not going to be the one that inherits the promise. But then what happens in his life that begins to manifest some of that? What's one of the first things we read about him doing? Made Rebekah really unhappy. He married Canaanite women. So, and it would seem, because it says that this was something that was bad for Isaac and Rebekah, that they did not like it, that he probably did so without seeking their counsel, without getting their approval. He just married them. And the way it's worded is in essence, they brought like a bad spirit into the family. Not bad spirit as in like a demon, but a bad vibe to the family. And it created a lot of tension and a lot of problems. And that's why you have eventually Rebekah saying, I don't want Jacob to marry any of these women. You need to have them go back to Laban, my brother. And so Esau, in marrying those women and so on and so forth, he goes a different direction. He's trying really hard to please his parents, because once he finds out that it bothered his parents that he married those two, he does go and try to marry a Midianite woman who would be from kind of a cousin tribe, and so there's things like that are going through. But what you basically see is he's just doing these things, trying all these things. But where does God sit down and talk to Esau? Where does God interact with Esau? So you don't see Esau doing a whole lot of worse stuff than Jacob. You just don't see God interacting with him. Whereas you look at Jacob, and Jacob's this conniving little brother who sneaky to get the birthright, does all of these different things. And yet when Esau gets mad at him and he's scared for his life and he's told to go up to Laban, what happens when he starts being on the way to go see Laban? Well, what we see is that, forgot about Isaac's second blessing. So he blesses, when he blesses Jacob again to send him to go get a wife. Interestingly, here it seems that Isaac has accepted within the second blessing that Jacob is the one who's inheriting the promise. There's an acceptance of that because the fruitful multiplication and inheriting the blessing of Abraham being specifically brought out shows that he sees that. So Jacob, when he flees, Esau is vowed to kill him, and he takes off to head north. Now, when he's heading north, he's 77 years old. Now, how many of you guys we typically picture him like 19, 20 at this point? Yeah. He is not that young. So he flees north to Haran. When he's fleeing north from Beersheba, he ends up stopping at this place and sleeping. And it's while he's sleeping that we have the story of Jacob's ladder. Angels are ascending and descending on this stairway or ladder, or whichever that it is. God speaks to Jacob from the top of that, saying, in essence, I'm going to bless you. The land you're laying on now is going to be yours. And so now it's not just a blessing from Isaac. It is from God's own mouth that he is the one who's going to inherit that blessing. But notice, up to this point, you're reading the story, Jacob's not shining bright as a great guy. He really hasn't been doing that wonderful. God just steps in and sovereignly says, you're the one. And so what happens after that? Well, Jacob then makes a vow. He sets up a stone there. He names it Bethel, which is house of God. It used to be called Luz, and all the people there that lived there were losers. I'm just kidding. This is another thing to realize within the Hebrew tradition, because they're looking and saying this is Bethel. When Joshua comes later on and they conquer Bethel, that probably had a different name in the Canaanites' vocabulary. But the Israelites are calling it Bethel because that's where Jacob had this vision. Another very important thing about what happens here, and I don't know if I'm getting ahead. I don't think I am. Here. So the high place, later on in the Old Testament, when we start going on, we're going to read and find out about Jeroboam starting the golden calf cult for northern Israel. So it's a worship of Yahweh, but it's not centered in Jerusalem. It is instead centered at Bethel and Dan. Now, when we get to Judges, we'll find out why Dan. Why is that a place that becomes a center for the golden calf cult? But when you look at Bethel, you actually seem to have a biblical backing for putting a temple to Yahweh at Bethel. Because this is where Jacob had this experience. He called it the house of God. And for many years, Bethel would be considered a high place. And there are different places within Israelite history that became high places because of the history. And yet those high places end up being forbidden eventually. So when we get to that time period with the kings, when we're dealing with the high places, and we sit there and like, why were these Israelites so dumb? Why'd they keep doing those high places? Because they actually had some, ways that they could legitimately argue for using those high places if it weren't for the fact that God just said don't do it. But they otherwise had reasons for that. So when he has this vision, he makes this vow to God, and he promises to give 1/10 of all he is given. So this 1/10 becomes this theme. Abraham giving 1/10 to Melchizedek. Here Jacob is promising 1/10 of all he's given will go to God. And the question that I have is like the 1/10 of all he's given, who's he giving it to? So, and that's one of the interesting things, like how is he doing this? And it probably would have been either through burnt offerings or sacrifices of some sort. So he arrives up in Haran, and he ends up getting to this well and inquiring about Laban and finding out that who's to be coming up but his cousin, who he will soon marry. But she's coming up to the well, and he helps her water the flock, says who he is, and then she runs back to her dad and tells her dad, and then they bring him in, and he's there. And he's there for about a month just staying with them, but he's working in their flocks and things like that. And so finally, Laban's like, well, hey, you're staying here, you're working, but I want you to work for nothing. What do you want? And he says, I will work for 7 years to be able to marry your daughter, Rachel. Now, we don't know at this point how old Rachel is. We just know that she has a sister who's older, and that one is Leah. So after the first 7 years of him working for Laban, it comes time for him to be able to marry Rachel. And when he reaches that point, they have the wedding ceremony, and the next morning he wakes up with Leah. Now, I don't know how much he had to drink at that wedding ceremony. I don't know what all went on, but I mean, for you to not know till the next morning, that's telling you something there. And so you have him, waking up, realizing the next morning this is Leah, going back and going, what did you do? And then Laban says, well, it's not our practice and custom to let the older marry off first before the younger, and so he has to wait 7 days, not the full 7 years. He waits 7 days to have the final wedding celebration to finish with Leah, and then begins. He has the wedding with Rachel, and then begins 7 years of labor for Rachel as well. Now, one of the interesting characters in all of this is Leah. I mean, what it would feel like, to be that option, the one who's kind of snuck in and put in there, which was kind of fitting for Jacob and the sneakiness that he had. But she's kind of snuck in there. She's not the one that is loved. It says so. It's interesting that he even refers to the fact that she is hated. Now, that doesn't mean that Jacob hated her as much as because of the comparison of how much he was in love with Rachel, it was like hatred to her. And really, that is a lot of the hatred, just like, I don't care, and not really wanting to be with her. But also, she was part of the deception. So you think of Jacob sitting there going like, you were part of tricking me, because she knew who she was that night and didn't say anything. And so so she was kind of in on that. So Jacob ends up marrying Rachel, and we now enter into what I like to call the War of the Wombs. Because you have these two women that are going back and forth. And so if you have the chart here, you can pull it out. And I'll come back to finish this slide after the chart, but we got it up here. And so while you have these first, there's going to be 7 years that 7 years from the time of the two weddings until Jacob says to Laban, I want to leave. And Laban's like, well, and they go through all these negotiations and come up with a way for Jacob to have, in a sense, an inheritance. And so he stays for another 6 years. So from the time of the wedding to the time he leaves is about 11 years. This may be where, when he goes through all the accounting back and forth of the children being born, then you have the time of now they're getting ready to leave, and we're going to have the account of the sheeps and with the sheep and the goats with the different patterns of on their fur. Is that what you call what they got? Okay, so anyways, so they but there might be a little bit here where it's not exactly chronological. So some of the children being born is going into that time as well, when he's gaining all of the flocks. But first we have here Reuben. He is the firstborn. And you wonder, well, if Reuben's the firstborn, why don't we have any kings of Israel from Reuben? Why do we not have any leaders of Israel from Reuben? The tribe of Reuben is not a predominant tribe within Israel. We're going to see in the story of Joseph, there is one place where Reuben, in a sense, tries to regain it, but there's a reason why he doesn't have it. And that is because at a certain point, Reuben, being the oldest, actually went in and lay with Bilhah, who was the concubine of Jacob through Rachel. So that violation, that you might say adultery that occurred, resulted in Reuben being removed out of the firstborn status. You have Reuben, you see the blessing here. Reuben, these are quotes of the blessings. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Uncontrolled as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, you defiled it. He went up to my couch, and that's it. In other words, nope, you're not firstborn anymore, and you're not preeminent anymore. So then it would fall to Simeon and Levi. However, both Simeon and Levi, you'll notice they're paired together in the blessing. It says, Simeon and Levi are brothers, their swords are implements of violence. Let my soul not enter into their counsel. Let not my glory be united with their assembly. Because in their anger they slew men, and in their self-will they lamed oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will disperse them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. This is why when you look on a map of Israel with the tribes of Israel, you will not see Simeon or Levi in a tribal territory. It's good. The blessing that he gives is completely fulfilled. Now, what happens is what happened that resulted in this. One, there seems to be they were just violent as a whole, but we will get to the story of their daughter or their sister Dinah being taken by the prince of Shechem, one of the cities there, and basically he violated their sister, so they asked the entire city to be circumcised, and while the entire city was in the pain of circumcision, just the two of them went in and killed the entire city. So they murdered an entire city out of vengeance. And so because of that, Jacob removes them. So Reuben, Simeon, Levi, they've lost their firstborn status. And so Judah then becomes the one who receives that, which is why you see Judah being the tribe through which the kings and everything come. And you'll notice with Judah's blessing, Judah is the lion's whelp from the prey. My son, you have gone up. He couches, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion who dares rouse him up. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. He ties his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine, and his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are dull from wine, and his teeth are white from milk. Now, the eyes being dull from wine here, you might say, well, that's a negative thing. What it's saying is that he's so prosperous and he's so at ease that he has plenty of milk, because milk was not something you typically kept to drink and stuff back at that time. And then you would have the wine showing all the prosperity that he would have. And then the ruler's staff not departing is actually the beginning of Judah being the tribe through which Christ would come, and through David and such would come as well. It's okay, Judean. I won't say your name because then the people online won't know. But, all right. So Issachar then comes after that. But you'll notice that in the birth order, it's 1, 2, 3, 4 with Judah, and then it stops. And that's because Leah has bore these 4 sons, and then she comes to the end of bearing those sons. And I'm trying to think if I'm getting ahead of myself here. I might be, but if I do, we'll just skip over the stuff later when we get to it. But when you have what you'll notice here with Judah, the prominence, read in the under important phrases, the prominence is transferred to Judah on account of the above, because the other 3 are cast out. And at Judah's birth, Leah sought God rather than seeking her husband. So with the first 3 boys, Leah was like, now my husband's going to love me. Now my husband's going to love me. Now my husband's going to love me with the first 3 boys. Judah came along and she's like, I'm just going to praise God. And you see that, and it's kind of interesting how that, you have the first 3 boys having all the, the issues, and then you have Judah who ends up becoming preeminent. Judah, by the way, is the one who's really going to shine during the Joseph story as well, as you'll see. And so Judah really does kind of fulfill these blessings and these circumstances. And so again, you see kind of the sovereignty of God and the blessing of Jacob and all these things kind of all working together. Now, once Judah was born, Leah stopped having kids, and Rachel's jealous. And so she's not having kids. She's still barren. And you see here, in a sense, almost the fairness of God. Like, Rachel, you're the one with the beauty and that has all the desire of Jacob. So I'm not giving you that. I'm giving this to Leah instead. And then with that, then Rachel goes to Jacob, and she's mad at Jacob because she doesn't have kids. And Jacob's like, "Am I God? I can't give you kids, and I can't do anything about that." And so still, and while she has that attitude in crying out, she still doesn't have kids. Now, when she does finally have kids, it says that God heard her prayers. So there is probably a time where she eventually just turned to God instead of being demanding and all the other things. But what happens instead is she's jealous, and so she takes her servant Bilhah and gives her to Jacob and says, "Have children through her, and they will be mine." Now, this is another thing that's attested to in those Mari and Nuzi texts, where you'll have a servant that will have children, but they will legally be the children of the wife, not the servant. And what you'll notice throughout the whole context of Genesis, that was the case. Those children that were born to Bilhah and Zilpah were Rachel and Leah's kids, legally, within the eyes of that day. And so you have Dan being born and Naphtali being born, and then Leah kind of like, okay, I'm getting jealous again. So she gives Zilpah to Jacob, and Gad and Asher are born. And then after Gad and Asher are born, you have Leah's womb being opened again, and she has Issachar and Zebulun. And then after that, finally, Rachel's womb is opened up, and she has Joseph, and then she has Benjamin. When she has Benjamin, however, she dies from the birth. And so what we're going to see as well is that with this death from the birth, there may be a reason as to why that happened. But Benjamin and Joseph then become the favored sons, although Joseph by far is the favored of those. And so all of these children except for Benjamin, so all the way up to Joseph, the first 11, were born while they were still with Laban. And then it's while they are coming back, it's that she is pregnant with Benjamin. But we also know that there's a good amount of time between Laban chasing them and her actually having Benjamin, because when Laban's chasing them, she claims to be having the way of women at that time, which she wouldn't have had if she was pregnant. Although she might have been just completely lying about it. So, real quick to cover these again. Jacob's children, you have that. You do have Jacob's daughter mentioned. He probably had more than Dinah as daughters, but Dinah is specifically mentioned because she also factors into the narrative. So it's actually quite likely that there were also more daughters born, but it may have only been male children, which would have been seen as a huge blessing. So Jacob blessed while with Laban. That entire time, you have Jacob going after the 7 years of working off what he had to for Rachel. He then goes to Laban and says, "I want to leave," but Laban's like, "Well, you can't take any of this with you," and so he makes this deal with Laban, and he says, "Tell you what, we'll do this. We'll separate out all the striped goats and the spotted goats and any of the black lambs, and those will be mine, and all the rest will be yours." After a certain amount of time, it would seem, although that doesn't seem to be given right away, but there's a certain amount of time because Laban keeps switching it. And we're not told of all the switches necessarily either, but Jacob says that he switched it 10 times on him. So they came up with this agreement. Now, what's intriguing with this is how does, when they go to separate the goats at first for this, Laban took all the spotted, all the striped, and all the black out of the flock that he gets and gives them to his sons, so that basically Jacob is starting with a flock with none of the stuff that would be his. So what does Jacob do? And this one's really interesting. Yeah, he takes sticks and he peels the bark off the sticks And when the strong sheep and goats and that were at the feeding troughs and things like that, he would put those sticks in front of them because often the mating happened while they were there. And so when the strong ones were there, he put those there so that the strong ones were reproducing spotted ones. Like, what does the sticks and the bark being peeled have to do with any of this? But God still did it. Now, the question is, did the sheep and the goats come out that way because of the sticks? What do you think? No. But why didn't God go, Jacob, what do you do with the sticks? He doesn't do that either. And you know, for all you know, I mean, Jacob keeps doing it and he thinks it's working. Now, I bring this up because we have to see how God's sovereign. God is blessing and doing that despite what Jacob is doing, not because of what Jacob is doing. And it's important for us to grasp that when it comes to how we go about church and things like that. Because we often think, well, the reason God's blessing the church is because we have this philosophy of ministry, or we chose this structure for everything, or we did this, and that's why he's blessing it. No, he's blessing it because he's had an eternal plan where the church can't be stood against by the gates of Hades. So we're going to succeed, and he's blessing it because we're his people, not because we peeled sticks in our sanctuary. Am I making sense? And this is where some of the theology of this comes out, is that we see that God had an intention to bless, and he was going to bless, and as goofy and dumb and tricky and everything that Jacob was, he couldn't screw up the blessing. And think about that, how amazing that is. Because it had nothing to do with Jacob. Yeah.
I just have to say, all that just makes me want to say praise God.
Yeah, it definitely wants you to make you say praise God, because it's you begin to see, and this is important for us as believers to grasp when Paul is trying to say, hey, you guys are children of promise. What does that mean? It's like this isn't on you. God's going to accomplish your salvation. He's accomplished your righteousness. He's going to accomplish your sanctification. He's going to accomplish your glorification. He's going to accomplish it all. And it's his promise. So where's the fear that I have that it ain't going to happen? But what if I do, dumb stuff like peel sticks? It's like, no, he'll find ways to, discipline you or whatever. And we'll see that there's a way that God kind of brings Jacob in and brings him to an understanding. But Jacob goes a number of years in his life just full of it. I mean, not really getting it. And yet God still blesses. And a lot of times we go back to these characters like, oh, we got to try to be like them so we'll get the blessing. Like, no, you're not getting. You don't want to be like Jacob. And so it's you want to have God as your God is what you want to have. So,
question.
Yes.
You take Romans 8:28.
Mm-hmm.
It says that we've got all things work together for good. Is that for the good of the person or the good of Christ and his will?
Uh-huh. So the question in Romans 8:28, when all things work to the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose, then, is that for the good of the person, the good of Christ? And the thing is, what is good for Christ is always good for the person. It does not feel like good for the person in all ways. Jacob, when he's serving under Laban and doing these things, he's going to complain to Laban. He's going to talk. He's like, I froze my tail off out there working for those sheep. I did all these other things, and you never honored. And he basically said, if my God didn't show up to you last night and scare you half to death, you'd probably be taking all of this from me. Mm-hmm. And he knows that, and there was that corruption of Laban, and Jacob had to endure all that. He had to go through those things, and there is a humbling that happens. But what's amazing is that when Jacob does go through all that, he ends up gaining this huge amount of flock. And when he has all these sheep, and Laban and his sons are looking, and like they already started by keeping that stuff from him, but he still has all of these sheep. They're like, man, he's taking everything. There goes our inheritance. Jacob begins to hear that and know that, and he goes to his two wives and like, we have to get out of Dodge. And God tells him, you need to head back to the land. And so rather than announcing that he's going to do that, because he is afraid, and probably rightly so, that Laban was going to take everything from him, so he leaves and gets a 3-day head start on Laban. And basically he ends up fleeing to this area which is called Gilead. Now, when they have this instance with Laban, they're going to put a stack of stones there, and he's going to call the place Galeed, which means the stack of stones. I don't know, there's not a real clear statement anywhere if Galeed is what got changed into Gilead. So that's why that was named that. But you have Gilead actually being mentioned in the Genesis story before you get Galeed being mentioned. So it's kind of a toss-up. But when he arrives and he gets into this area, this is where Laban catches up with him. And so when he catches up with Jacob, I feel he had evil intent. He says to Jacob, I have the ability here with me to take you out, which means he had soldiers with him and such. But the night before he overtakes Jacob, God appeared to him in a dream and says, you are not to say anything good or bad to Jacob. You are to do nothing. And so he's stopped from being able to do any of that negative to Jacob. So he pursues him and he's like, why didn't you let me say goodbye to my children? And why didn't you, and it's like Jacob explains, because you'd have killed us. But he's like, well, why did you take my household idols? Because Rachel, when they had left, had stolen the household idols. Now, why had she done that? One explanation is that the household idols were actually an indication that the inheritance was yours and you had a portion of the inheritance. You have Rachel and Leah saying to each other, what portion do we even have in the inheritance of our father? They've treated us like aliens. And so she may have taken them out of vengeance or things like that toward her brothers. It is possible that she was still in the practice of worshiping those idols, and that there were others with their group that were in the practice of worshiping those idols. Because we'll see when Jacob gets to Bethel and has another encounter with God, he then tells his whole household to put all their idols away. So clearly, they had them when they got there, and they were not dealt with in a religious sense prior to that. So they hadn't purified themselves that way before then. So Laban leaves and goes the other direction. They set the stones up, and basically it's like, I'm not going to cross over and go after you. You're not going to cross past these stones and come after me. And that's kind of the last we really hear of that interaction. So then Jacob moves on to Mahanakim. You guys ever listen to old-time radio? There was this one old-time radio program. I wish I could remember what it was, but it was like the Great Mahanakim, and I thought, what a name. Then I found out, like, that's where they got it from. There's nothing new under the sun. But so they get to Mahanaim, which means two camps. And it's at this point that Jacob is actually met by angels of God. So he interacts with angels, and he recognizes at this point the blessing of God, because he reaches a point that he passed through on his way out. And when he passed through on his way out, he had a staff in his hand and the clothes on his back and nothing else. And he's now coming in with 4 wives, 11 kids, huge flocks, everything. I mean, he's a very wealthy man at this point, and he realizes that faithfulness of God to bless him. So he separates them out into the 2 camps. Part of the reason he's separating them into 2 camps is because he is now back in the region where Esau is, and Esau, last he had heard, wanted to kill him. And so he separates them into 2 camps, saying, well, if they attack the one camp, the other camp might be able to get away. And so that's one of the reasons he separates them into 2 camps. Then, when he moves on to Penuel, he has to cross over the Jabbok River there. Is it the Jabbok or Yarmuk? Anyways, I believe it's the Jabbok. So he's going to cross over at this point. And as while he sends everybody else over the river, and he's the last one to still be on the shore. And this is when a man shows up and begins to wrestle with him. And he wrestles with him all night long. And at the end of the time of, as morning is starting to come, the man's like, let me go. It's morning. I'm getting out of here. And Jacob won't let him go. And he's like, no, tell me who you are. And he won't tell him who he is. And you get the sense that Jacob kind of knows who he is. And then eventually the man touches Jacob's hip. And from there on out, Jacob walks with a limp. And then Jacob as well is renamed from Jacob to Israel. Now, why is that? If you look in the Hebrew, you can this is Israel, and you see these three letters are present here, and then the L, you see them here, and this is, I'll name you, your name should be Israel, because you wrestled with God. And so you see that Israel comes out of that word wrestling with God, and that's why we call him that. Now, why would God do this? Why would God have a wrestling match with Jacob? Any idea? Is it a picture of anything? Any of you feel like during your life you've wrestled with God a little bit?
I think it's a picture of a championship game where God is going to finally get the rule, and Jacob is going to be under and willingly under.
Okay. So championship game, kind of like a prize fight, and he's going to win? Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that there's a picture here as well of the people that God chooses while we're in this life and have all of this junk that we're dealing with and the sinfulness of our hearts and the desires of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and everything else. It's a constant wrestle till the day we die. It's a striving. But God's doing. He didn't wrestle with Esau. He didn't appear to Esau. He didn't talk to Esau. He didn't intervene in Esau's life. He didn't do any of that. So when I said earlier that Esau and Jacob play out that chosenness and unchosenness, what you see in the chosenness of Jacob is he's a piece of work that God's involved in. Esau is a piece of work that God's just not involved in. They're both pieces of work. But you see the chosenness is not that Jacob was better, smarter, or whatever. It was God chose him, and so God stepped in. And Jacob, through this process, like Abraham, is persuaded to believe, is brought to that point where he sees the faithfulness of God. When God showed up to him at Bethel, he hadn't first done some profession of something. God just showed up and said, I'm God. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and you, and I'm going to do this, and we'll see you when you're back in the land. And he did it. And so Jacob is brought to this place where he sees it, he experiences it, he knows it, he believes it, and this is when he gets back at Bethel then and has the experience with God. He's like, get rid of all your idols. We're done with all this stuff. But it's like you'd have thought he'd have been at that point way, way back again. Yeah. But he wasn't. So to me, I think the wrestling, this picture of wrestling with him, but then also the touching of the hip, we're not really told for sure exactly what the touching of the hip was about, but I do like that idea of the, my strength is made perfect in your weakness, and that, yes, you've wrestled with me, but I've won, for one, and you will have a constant reminder of me, and it's my work, and it's not you. And so that hip for him would be an everyday reminder that it was not because of him, it was because of what God did to happen.
Thorn in the flesh.
Yep, New Testament thorn in the flesh. My weakness, his strength is made perfect in our weakness. So while he's here at Penuel, you have Esau who does come up. Esau has settled down in this area, much to the fulfillment of Isaac's prophecy that you will settle away from the fruitful land and so on and so forth. So he settles here in what becomes known as Edom. But he comes up to meet Jacob, having heard of Jacob. And so what does Jacob do? Jacob starts sending all these gifts forward to him. And so he sends this gift and this gift. And it's interesting to me that he, as he sends his family forward, it's like he he sends Leah and her kids forward first, and then he sends Rachel and the kids forward, and then he kind of comes last. But he gets there. He had heard that Esau had over 400 men with him. He's scared, but he gets there. There was no reason to be scared. Esau basically says, "I've been blessed." Another thing that you see is that within the whole plan of God, even though Esau was not one of those chosen, he was still a descendant of Abraham, and God was still faithful in fulfilling his promise that Esau would be blessed. So Esau is still blessed. What you don't see is the direct interaction with Esau and the making him, I am your God, I am present with you. You don't have that, but he's still blessed in the faithfulness to the promise that was made. So after this then, Esau heads back and he goes for Mahanakim. Instead of continuing down, he ends up going down the river to Sukkoth and settles there for a time. Then, after being at Sukkoth, he goes up and he settles near Shechem. Now, it's while they're settled near Shechem that Dinah is violated by the prince of Shechem. And he comes and he says, "I want to marry your daughter and your sister." And that's when the brothers come in. It's interesting that the brothers are the ones calling the shots, not Jacob. And so the brothers are like, "Okay, you can marry her if you're all circumcised." And as I said, the prince is circumcised, but all the men of the city are circumcised as well. And that enables the two brothers, Levi and Simeon, to go in and wipe out the whole city. This becomes significant next time we meet and we talk about the Israelites going into, actually it won't be the next time, it'll be a couple times from now. But when they cross the Jordan River and they're on the other side of the river and there's no more geographical barrier of the river for defense, they have no walls around them, and yet God says, "Okay, circumcise your whole nation." The amount of faith it took to circumcise all the men, and God says to him, "I will be the wall for Israel." And they had to believe that God was just going to protect them because they basically incapacitated all their men when they had no more defenses. And Shechem is a demonstration of just how much that incapacitated the city. So from Shechem then, he goes on to Bethel once again. And while he is at Bethel, God reaffirms the covenant with Jacob and renames him again to Israel. Again says, you'll be called Israel. And it's at this point then that God, that Jacob then tells all of his family, you need to put away all of your idols. And then you have, around this time, is when they then move on to Hebron. But in the traveling to Hebron, anyone have an idea of what city would be about right here? Or what town? What's that? So Jerusalem's like right here, but just south of Jerusalem, Bethlehem. Now, as they're going through Bethlehem, that is when Rachel gives birth to Benjamin and dies. Why is that significant? As we're going to get to in the Gospel of Matthew, as we get into the Christmas story, when Herod goes to Bethlehem and has all of the children murdered, and it says, I hear Rachel crying for her children. Because she's, why would Bethlehem be Rachel's children? Because she is buried there. She is buried in Bethlehem. So that helps us understand a little bit of that. This is also, again, where Reuben ends up sleeping with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and then forfeits his place in the line of succession. And so then they settle in Hebron, and it's at this point that the story shifts away from Jacob and on to Joseph. And that's where we're going to pick up next time. I do want to discuss, though, a little bit here. Just because it can be complicated in today's thinking, what do we do with the polygamy that we see here happening with Jacob? What do we do with the, here are these concubines being given and everything else like that? It's like, is God okay with all of this? What do you guys think? Okay. He's not okay, but he's blessing. He's giving them children and being fruitful, and he's active in this whole thing.
So just another way of them trying to make things work themselves, and God's just trying to do what he was going to do.
Yeah. I mean, when we say that all things work to the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose, does that mean that everybody who loves him and are called according to his purpose always do the smartest, best thing? Or even the most godly thing? Or always do the right thing? But a lot of times within our faith, we reach this point where it's like, I have to do all the right stuff, or this isn't going to happen. And that's often the message we can put out within the church. If you didn't do it right, if you did it wrong, if you made the wrong decision, you got to choose who you're going to marry, because if you marry the wrong person, then everything's going to fall apart. Really? Yeah.
Well, actually, it kind of did fall apart for Solomon. I mean, his wives turned him away from God toward the end of his life, and even built him temples.
Right. But when you look at, you sit there and say, does God tell you, who you should marry? No, but he tells you how to find them and how to weigh them. And so there are instructions within Scripture, for instance, of don't marry a non-believer. We have that in the New Testament. For Israel, it was don't marry a Gentile. You had to marry within those who are actually worshiping God, and so on and so forth. What I'm kind of getting at is we can make all the choices we want as we go through, but we're always making choices at the level of knowledge we have at that time, which is never enough knowledge to be perfect. Which is why Paul says, if at some point you disagree, God will make that known to you. Just live up to what you already know. And this is kind of what I want to bring out to you, is that God is looking for us to live up to what we already know, to live up to where he has already brought us. God knows where he's going to bring each and every one of us and what process he's going to do to bring us there. So God knew what he was going to do with Jacob. When he's at Bethel the first time, and he's saying to Jacob, you're going to head up there and you're going to go through all of these things, but I'm going to bring you back to this land. And he knew all of what was going to happen. And so you see Jacob going up. Now Jacob, in his place, in his understanding of God, may have felt like, well, I should do this, and I need to do this. I need to put branches out there. I need to, there are things that he might have had that put that out there. But there's also things, like when you think about Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah, and you're like, this is such a, soap opera, for goodness sakes, about all of this stuff. And like, is God okay with that? We have to go back into that culture and realize they were normal. What they were doing was typical of their time for women in their position. It's strange to us, it's alien to us, but they were doing what was normal to their culture. We know that because, like I said, we go to the different archaeological discoveries, the Nag Hammadi and Marianuzis. It's like we see these traditions mentioned in there that this was normal for that culture. We might, in our modern sensibility, say this is so oppressive. It's so oppressive to women. But if you go back into that culture, it's very different. We're measuring them by something we're 3,000 years later with a very different measure and a very different tool for evaluation. And there are definite signs within there that they are happy and sad, just like people are today. They have children. In the end, they were all very wealthy. They were all very well-to-do and had a lot. But you see this thing happening. Now, this doesn't mean that God is saying, hey, here's my thumbs up to polygamy. Here's my thumbs up to women being this way or men being this way. we need to be careful to think that God's blessing means God's approval. God's blessing happens because of his faithfulness to his promise. Regardless of what we do, it does not mean always his approval. And so this is why, you could have a church that could seem to be like thriving and God is really blessing, and then all of a sudden this pastor completely goes off the rails and commits adultery and all of this other stuff. And like, oh, how could God bless it? Well, God's blessing because it's his church. And he blesses despite those things. When that guy makes that choice, just like here, there are consequences. Rachel, when she took the gods and she hid those from Laban, what Jacob says to Laban is actually significant. He says to Laban, if anyone here took your idols, they shall die. And what happened? She died. And you see that. And now there's no verse that says therefore she died or something like that, but you can see that consequences are there. There's still things that happen. God still has those. Now, what's interesting, and we're going to see as we get further into the Old Testament, is that God will bring consequences that discipline his people, but it doesn't mean that the person he disciplined now is in hell. Like Rachel, she dies. If that was discipline because of that, that doesn't mean that, well, Rachel's not going to heaven now. It's not that. Like when you see Achan, when Achan is going to be the one who takes the items and stuff and resulted in a bunch of Israelites being killed when they attack Ai, he and his family are become, in a sense, the examples to Israel of you have to honor God and be true to that. Does that mean that Achan and his family are not in heaven? No. It just means they were disciplined. They received the just thing, but they were part of God's people. He confessed, and he actually repented. So what I'm trying to get across to this is throughout the Old Testament, when you see God behaving this way with Jacob, you're learning his thoughts and his ways. We know, we all can read this and know Jacob did not get all those sheep because of the bark and the sticks. And we all know that. But let's look at how God responded. Now, we might come in and go, what's wrong with you? God can't bless you because you're doing all this bark and the sticks, and he didn't tell you, and no one comes and tells Jacob that. He just does it, and God just blesses him. Now, does Jacob eventually get to a point where he probably looked back and went, yeah, that was dumb? But how many times does that happen in our life? And I want you guys to think back through your walk with the Lord. There's things that I did when I was younger because I'm like, this is the way to please the Lord. And God was like, still blessed it. But I was just convinced of, this or this. And you grow and you learn. There's people that are brought to the Lord through things. My mother-in-law was brought to the Lord after reading the late great Planet Earth. I still don't recommend the book. But what it did is it woke her up to those things. And what sometimes happens is we have experiences that we link to God's blessing, and then we feel that sanctifies the experience. One of the reasons that Martin Luther and John Calvin couldn't really get along was because Martin Luther's position on communion. Anyone know what Martin Luther's position on communion was? Do you guys know the difference between transubstantiation, consubstantiation, and just symbolism? Transubstantiation, the Catholics believe that as soon as you bless the cup and the bread of communion, it switches and genuinely, physically becomes the body and blood of Christ. It is not symbolic. It is genuinely switched its substance and becomes something different. Calvin comes out and says, no, it's just symbolic. And then Luther says, I'd rather take communion with the Pope than with Calvin. Why? Luther, when he came to Christ, what happened was he was a priest and he was going to perform his first communion. And in the Catholic tradition, only the priest drinks from the cup. And so Luther took the cup and he holds it up and he's about to take from the cup for the very first time, but he felt so unworthy he couldn't drink from it. And he put it down and he failed at his first communion. And that caused him to search, drove him to Romans, brought him to the place where he saw salvation by faith. Well, here was this belief of the cup, and being what it was, that led him to such wonderful truth. So clearly the belief in the cup must be true. But do you see how that's like the branches and the bark of what Jacob was doing? We have to be careful that we let Scripture always work into us and not hold on to something just because somewhere back in our life it was connected with the blessing of God. Scripture has to always be the thing we weigh everything by, not the emotional feeling we have for something that was very influential in my life. There have been people who have followed teachers into spiritual deadness because they thought it was the teacher that brought them to that point. And they just keep following them and following them instead of realizing that actually God uses even people who don't teach the way they should or for the right reasons. Anyone know the passage that tells us that makes that plain? God uses people even when they're teaching for wrong motives and stuff.
Philippians.
Yep.
Paul was in prison, others were preaching, and he was that they were preaching.
Yeah, Philippians 1, some are preaching to cause me problems, some are preaching for good reasons, but nonetheless I rejoice because the gospel was preached. Why? Because the word of God is what's powerful, never the person. And so that's why we always have to be careful that we don't cling to the things through which we think the blessing came, like the sticks and stuff like that, but we cling to God and the blessing and his word. So, all right, any final questions before we close out for the night? Yes.
Did the Hebrews place any significance on their kids when they went and named them?
Did the Hebrews place significance on the kids when they named them? The names definitely mean a lot. In fact, some of the names with the children of Jacob can be significant. One of the first one that comes to mind is like Dan. Interestingly, Rachel, when Dan is born to Zilpah, Rachel says, God has judged me and given me this son. The word judged there is not necessarily that God is punishing her, but rather God has judged her and seen her either ready or been vindicated so that he could give her a son, is how she sees it in her mind. But then Dan is also the tribe through which the judge Samson, one of the greatest of the judges, comes through. So it's kind of like this interesting play on that.
Well, I was wondering when Isaac they named Jacob, that word means deceiver. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering why you would name your kid.
Isaac means laughter. Jacob means deceiver.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Jacob means deceiver.
Yeah. Well, it means grasp the heel is what is, and but it kind of became, and the thing when it becomes deceiver, that may be because of Jacob himself. In other words, he was called that because he grasped the heel, but then you see Jacob's life of deceive, and they're picked up that meaning because of Jacob, not he wasn't named that way. He wasn't named because it meant deceiver at that time.
Okay, what?
Yeah, life gave it meaning. Yeah.
And what the sister said back here earlier about the angels, I always thought the angels had a free will. They could think and reason just like we did. Mm-hmm. And it was Lucifer's decision because he was the head of all the angels, so he must have had beauty and significance to which a third of them fell. Mm-hmm. Okay, so do I have that right? He had a free will just like we do.
I believe he had a free will, and the angels have a free will. I believe that when it refers to the elect angels, they're angels that God, like us, he interacts with them to prevent them from falling. One of the biggest things to get across is when I talk about living out the concept of election, we have to see that election is primarily played out by God's choice to interact. Yeah. So, in other words, the non-chosen is God's choice to, I'm not going to interact. So when you talk about the hardening of the heart that you'd get to in that discussion, the hardening of the heart is God, knowing that humans by nature of their pride and who they are will harden themselves off unless he softens. And so he says he'll soften who he softens and he'll harden whom he hardens. And so what you see is with Jacob, he softened him. He got involved. He intervened. And that is how you see the election of Jacob being played out. In direct contrast to Esau, who was not really any worse than Jacob, you just don't see God interacting and bringing him along that same line.
And when Satan was cast down, was the earth being formed, or was it completely formed when he came down here? When he was cast down here?
That was when we cover. Basically, my view is that he did not fall until he was in the Garden of Eden and the creation was done.
Okay, that's what I thought too. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that was it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the Lord said, I saw him cast down, right?
Yeah.
He saw him cast down, but that's actually at the time of his ministry when his disciples went out and cast a whole bunch of demons out of people. And so, and then in Revelation 12, when it says that Satan was cast down, that also, if you look in the timeline of that passage, would be at the time of Jesus' ministry. So we talked about that a number of weeks back. When it comes to the spiritual realm, we are not given a lot of information, and I'm really glad, because it is the habit of humans, and this is why Paul, warns in Colossians about getting caught up into visions and angels and things like that. Angels have a role; they fulfill that role. We're not supposed to pursue them. We're not supposed to try to, grasp all of those things. When they fulfill the role, great. But I think humans would be prone to pursue them, which I think the angels took advantage of those that fell and wanted the interaction with humans, and thus fell and became what are the pagan gods, in my view. So, yeah.
I have a question about, more than one wife or husband.
Uh-huh.
Of course, when we saw Adam and Eve, God made one woman from one man. Where did it start to change? Was it after the flood, or was it before the flood?
So where did it change from like one woman for one man to?
Well, when they started having more than one wife, where they would have it constantly.
Already in Genesis, right after the creation, you have Lamech, who's got 2 wives going already. It did not take long for that. It's important to remember as well that in the ancient world, the survival rate of female children to male children was very different. So there were far more females than there were males at that time. And the multiple wives thing, to give you an example, a professor of mine who is from India had a friend who, we think that it's just oppressive. He had a friend who married a woman, and then she asked him to marry her friend so they could be together all the time. And then they asked him to marry one other woman so that she could take care of their kids. and so, in other words, the guy, he was very wealthy, but it was his wives asking for it. And that may be just like totally foreign to us, but we have to realize how much we have brought in romanticism, which is a Western philosophy that came after Enlightenment, and we've romanticized these relationships, which we say, well, isn't that great? Well, it's led to a lot of divorces, so I don't know how great it is that we've overly romanticized it. And so, but we get into this very romantic where the one man, one woman almost gets to this place where anything but that must be horribly evil. The problem with that is that when you do go to the Old Testament, God doesn't seem extremely put off by that. He warns not to multiply wives, primarily because of the negative effect it would have, like with Solomon. And it was the kings were not to multiply wives because one of the main ways they did that was treaties with other nations. And God didn't want that. It's not always because, he just wants to preserve this romantic relationship between 2 people. Now, the romance was still there. Isaac and Rebekah were clearly romantic with each other. The clear prohibition of across the board of polygamy does not happen until the New Testament, when Paul says, because of the immorality of the times, each man should have his own wife and each wife her own husband. But he prefaces it with because of the immorality of the times, so as not to condemn all those biblical characters
But
in
he
the
still
past.
used the one man and one woman together as a union as a picture of the church. The Godhead.
Yep, and
So
when
that's
Jesus
still
says this is how it was, this is how it was intended, was you have a man and a woman that come together and they are one flesh, and let no one put that asunder. What we have to understand is that in the past ancient times, like I said, because of the number of women that were there versus the number of men, the world being very different, you weren't able to just go out and get a job as a female, and it wasn't so much like that was just a sexist thing. It's like you didn't have manufacturing, you didn't have jobs that weren't physical labor and stuff like that. But women definitely were. I mean, Rachel was a shepherdess, so you clearly had roles and stuff that they play. But it was definitely, you wanted to have family, you wanted to have kids, you wanted to have that, and there was no issue with that perspective back then. That's a modern take on it to be anti that. And what we have to realize is that when you these 7 things God hates, or these 6 things God hates and 7 that he detests, none of those have to do with the sexual immorality. And not to say that sexual immorality isn't wrong, but we have in modern times, somewhat due to the romantic movement and stuff like that, exalted sexual sins way up here. But gossip, lying, slander, that's not as bad. When Scripture actually has them like this, they're both sins. But the gossip and the slander, God hates those more because of how hateful they are. Whereas, you have the romantic stuff, and you got at least 2 people loving, but they're just loving in a way that's outside of their love for God. Slander just hates everyone involved. So, yeah.
Another thing that's helped me is the idea that you don't really know what's wrong until God gives the law.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't give the law until they were Mount Sinai, and they were preliminarily to going into becoming a country. There were probably millions of people there.
Yep.
And he didn't give the law until he gave it to the whole country. So everybody knew what was right and wrong, not an individual like Jacob, where that may not have spread. But you get into Leviticus, and you have all kinds of specific details as to what is right and what is wrong, what's immoral.
Yep.
And Paul said at one time, I think he said, I wouldn't have known that covetousness was idolatry if it had not been for the law.
Yep.
And so he said the law was good.
Right. Yep. And, in a sense, the law brings death because it tells you what that action deserves, but the death was already present in you because of the sin, and that's there. One thing I discovered that as I was reading and prepping for this, is that there is a statement to Isaac about Abraham following all of God's, I think it's like commands and statutes and laws. And it caught me off guard because I made a statement even earlier of he didn't have it. I still think that for the most part he didn't. I don't think that he was given like the Mosaic law. But you can tell that there's probably more interactions between God and Abraham, and God expressing his desires to Abraham than what we necessarily have recorded in the passages.
God obviously gave commands.
Yeah.
He even told Adam and Eve, not to eat that tree. So that was
every command that he gave would be a command. Yep. So yeah.
And then also relationship. This is just a thought that came to me because of the question about angels. I'm assuming that the chosen angels do not have a depravity. They've not sinned. There's no reason for them to be depraved. And therefore they will not sin because God has protected them from that.
Yeah, I would agree that the angels that the elect angels and those that have not sinned are not depraved. They are free from depravity, and they are the ones that watch us. And what's interesting is they watch us. They're not depraved. They can go in and out of the presence of God, and yet they're amazed to see what God's doing in the church. So it shows they don't have that full comprehension and ability to fathom all of what God is doing. And so there's almost that sense of where they function as lesser or as messengers, and we are lesser than them now. But almost as it says in Hebrews, that time will come where it's really there are ways we are greater than they are. in that sense. So what's really interesting when it gets to the point of what we're going to judge the angels. It's like, really? I got to find that guardian angel that didn't stop that accident. I'm just kidding. But yeah. So, all right. Well, thank you guys, and have a great week. And we'll see you guys after Thanksgiving for this class at least. I'll see you before then otherwise.
How about Sunday?